Blade Runner wasn't just a sci-fi noir about hunting artificial humans. It was a production nightmare that nearly destroyed careers, a film that was savaged upon release, and a vision so ahead of its time that it took decades for audiences. While Rick Deckard hunted replicants on screen behind the cameras, the production spiraled into chaos. Harrison Ford and director Ridley Scott barely spoke. The British crew openly mocked Scott's demanding style, calling him governor, with thinly veiled the constant artificial rain and smoke made everyone miserable, and the studio executives were panicking as the budget ballooned and test audiences fled the screenings. Today, I'm going to reveal 20 weird facts about Blade Runner that even die-hard fans might not know. And stick around until the end, because the bonus fact explains a mysterious production decision that has confused viewers for over 40 years. So jack into your machine and prepare for some serious off-world intel, because the truth behind Blade Runner is stranger than any science fiction. 1. The title came from a completely different. Blade Runner wasn't originally called Blade Runner. Philip K. Dick's novel that inspired the film was titled Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Not exactly marquee material. Producer Michael Dealey spotted the title Blade Runner in a completely unrelated screenplay by William S. Burroughs, based on a book called The Blade Runner by Alan E. Nourse. Harrison Ford didn't just dislike making Blade Runner, he actively loathed the entire experience. The set was perpetually dark, wet, and filled with smoke that irritated his eyes and lungs. The demanding night shoots left him exhausted and miserable. But it wasn't just the physical conditions that soured him. Ford and director Ridley Scott battled constantly over the character of Deckard. Ford didn't understand why his character needed so little dialogue and emotional range. "I played a detective who didn't have any detecting to do," Ford later complained. Their relationship deteriorated to the point where they communicated primarily through intermediaries on set. Years later, when asked about returning for the voiceover sessions, Ford acidly remarked, "I was forced to do a narration that I fought against. It was an artistic rape." The bitterness lingered for decades, with Ford refusing to discuss the film in interviews until the 2000s, when he finally acknowledged its artistic significance. 3. The famous Tears in Rain monologue was mostly improvised. Rutger Hauer received the script for Roy Batty's death scene and found it overwrought, a lengthy melodramatic speech that missed the mark. The night before filming, alone in his trailer, Hauer took a pen and ruthlessly cut the monologue down, retaining just a few original lines. Then he added the now iconic phrase, "All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain." The next day, without warning, Hauer performed his rewritten version. The crew fell silent. Cinematographer Jordan Cronenweth kept the camera rolling as rain poured down on Hauer's face. When Hauer delivered the Tears in Rain line and released the dove, the set remained hushed. Ridley Scott, notorious for demanding countless takes, simply said, "Cut, print. That's a wrap." What was left wasn't just dialogue, but poetry. Not a death scene, but a meditation on mortality. The most profound moment in the film came not from a screenwriter's careful planning, but from an actor's midnight inspiration. 4. The film's budget spiraled out of control. What began as a modest $13 million production rapidly transformed into a financial nightmare. Ridley Scott, fresh off Alien, wasn't just creating scenes, he was building an entire world. Each street required countless neon signs, each room filled with retrofitted technology. When producers visited the set, they didn't see cost-effective filmmaking. They saw Scott commissioning custom-made newspaper vending machines that would appear on screen for mere seconds. By mid-production, Blade Runner was hemorrhaging $100,000 per day over budget. Executive producer Bud Yorkin was dispatched to the set with one mission: rein in Scott's extravagance. Their confrontation erupted into a shouting match so intense that crew members fled the vicinity. The film's completion bond was nearly revoked, which would have shut down production entirely. The final budget ballooned to over $28 million, more than double the original estimate. Upon release, the film earned just $32 million, barely breaking even. The studio executives who had gambled on Scott's vision found themselves facing not profit, but financial catastrophe. The dangerous filming conditions sent crew members to the hospital. The Blade Runner set wasn't just uncomfortable, It was Hazardous. For months, the cast and crew worked in a perpetual artificial night, breathing air thick with chemical smoke and standing in recycled water mixed with chemicals to make it more reflective. The Warner Brothers backlot transformed into a toxic swamp. Joanna Cassidy, who played the replicant Zora, performed her death scene crashing through real glass, not the standard sugar glass used for safety, resulting in multiple cuts. Daryl Hannah's slip during her character Pris's death scene wasn't planned. She actually injured herself on broken set pieces, but continued the take. The crew suffered most. 2 lighting technicians were hospitalized after electrical accidents in the perpetually wet conditions. 1 camera assistant developed a respiratory infection so severe he couldn't return to work. Ridley Scott, pursuing his vision with relentless determination, didn't slow production. The physical toll was considered simply the price of making art. As one crew member later put it, "We weren't making a film, we were surviving one." 6. Ridley Scott deliberately antagonized Harrison Ford to get the performance he wanted. Ridley Scott didn't just clash with Harrison Ford, he methodically provoked him. Scott recognized that Deckard needed to appear emotionally drained, questioning his own humanity. Rather than rely on Ford's acting, Scott orchestrated conditions to genuinely wear Ford down. Scott repeatedly called for takes after midnight, when Ford was exhausted. He deliberately kept the set frigid and wet, even during Ford's non-action scene. When Ford arrived on set, Scott would sometimes announce last-minute dialogue changes, eliminating Ford's preparation time. The most calculating move came mid-production. Scott had craft services remove all chairs from the set except his own, forcing Ford to stand for hours between takes. When Ford discovered this deliberate slight, he confronted Scott, who calmly replied, "Deckard wouldn't sit. Why should you?" The technique worked. On screen, Ford appears genuinely haggard, his eyes reflecting real weariness and simmering resentment. The performance wasn't just acting, it was documented psychological warfare. Years later, when asked if he regretted his methods, Scott simply said, "I got what the film needed." 7. The studio forced a happy end that everyone hated. Test audiences emerged from early screenings confused and depressed. The studio panicked. Their expensive sci-fi noir was tracking to become a commercial disaster. Their solution? Force a happy ending onto the film. Ridley Scott was ordered to shoot new footage showing Deckard and Rachel escaping the oppressive city, driving through lush countryside toward freedom. These scenes weren't filmed on location. They were cobbled together using leftover helicopter footage from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which Warner Brothers owned. Ford was dragged back to record an upbeat voiceover explaining that Rachel was special and didn't have the limited lifespan of other replicants. The studio even instructed the sound editors to brighten the music for the final scene. The resulting theatrical cut felt schizophrenic. A dark, philosophical film suddenly transformed into a romantic escape fantasy in its final minutes. Scott was devastated. Screenwriter Hampton Fancher refused to attend the premiere. It would take 25 years and 5 different versions before Scott could finally release his intended vision in the final cut. 8. Philip K. Dick never saw the finished film. Philip K. Dick, whose novel, Sti Shamdafi, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, provided the foundation for Blade Runner, maintained a complicated relationship with the initially skeptical. He famously dismissed the project as likely to become a bad imitation of Star Wars. When production began, Dick refused invitations to visit the set. His stance softened dramatically after viewing effects footage and reading a revised script. In December 1981, Dick was shown a special effects reel and Ridley Scott's designs. His reaction was electric. "How is this possible? How did you capture my imagination?" He immediately called his agent, raving that the film would revolutionize science fiction. But fate intervened with cruel timing. On March 2, 1982, just 3 months before Blade Runner's release, Dick suffered a stroke and died at age 53. He never witnessed the initial commercial failure, the critical reassessment, or the film's eventual recognition as a masterpiece that would cement his own literary reputation. The author, who spent his career questioning the nature of reality and human identity, never experienced how profoundly his ideas would reshape popular culture through Scott's visual interpretation. 9. The film's visual effects were created using prehistoric methods. In our CGI-saturated era, Blade Runner's effects seem impossible. The sprawling cityscapes, flying cars, and massive video billboards weren't digital creations. They were physical models, photographed by hand. The iconic opening shot of Los Angeles 2019, with its belching fire towers and endless cityscape, was built as a miniature measuring 15 feet wide. Effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull's team constructed it using model kits, repurposed plastic toys, and thousands of fiber optic lights individually wired and controlled. Each building was meticulously detailed, even on sides that would never appear on camera. Famous Tyrrell pyramids weren't rendered in a computer. They were brass models photographed through layers of the spinners, flying cars, were suspended on thin wires, manually moved frame by frame. When digital technology proved inadequate for the video billboards, Trumbull projected actual footage onto miniature screens and rephotographed them. One effects shot typically required weeks of preparation for seconds of screen time. The 167 effects shots in Blade Runner took nearly a year to complete. What audiences saw wasn't digital trickery, but the height of analog craftsmanship, a handmade future that, ironically, our digital age still struggles to match. 10. Daryl trained with an Olympic gymnast for her death scene. Daryl Hannah didn't just perform a few stunts for her role as Pris, she transformed herself physically. For her character's distinctive pleasure model movements, Hannah spent months training with Olympic gymnast Mitch Gaylord, developing a specific physical vocabulary that would appear inhuman yet graceful. The backflips Pris performs weren't added in post-production or performed by a double. That was Hannah herself, after weeks of painful training. For Pris's death scene, Hannah insisted on performing the violent convulsions herself. The thrashing was so intense that she chipped her elbow in 8 places during filming. The disturbing, mechanized death rattle wasn't added by sound designers. Hannah created that inhuman sound herself, shocking the crew into silence. Go ahead and like and subscribe, because there's plenty more insanity coming up, including how one actor's injury during filming actually made it into the final cut and became one of the movie's most memorable moments. Plus, you'll discover which A-list actress was originally cast as Rachel but was fired after just 3 days of shooting. 11. Sean Young was nearly fired. Multiple times. Sean Young's casting as Rachel wasn't just controversial, it almost didn't survive production. Young, only 22 and relatively inexperienced, found herself overwhelmed by Scott's demanding directing style and the film's troubled atmosphere. Her relationship with Harrison Ford deteriorated so severely that their romantic scenes became excruciating to. During one notorious incident, Young put Scotch tape on her buttocks before a love scene with Ford, as Scott and Ford didn't laugh. Production halted as Scott berated Young in front of the entire crew. Producer Michael Dealey drafted termination paperwork twice during filming, stopped only by the prohibitive cost of recasting and reshooting. The tension wasn't one-sided. Young later claimed Scott deliberately isolated her, giving minimal direction while lavishing attention on other actors. Their conflicts grew so intense that for some scenes, Scott would direct Young through an assistant, rather than speak to her directly. The irony wasn't lost on the crew. The actress playing the most sophisticated replicant was treated as the most dispensable element of production. Years later, Young reflected, "I was young and full of myself, but I was playing a robot, so who was actually acting inappropriately?" 12. The iconic Voight-Kampff machine was a last-minute creation. The Voight-Kampff machine, the polygraph-like device Deckard uses to identify replicants, has become one of science fiction's most recognizable props. But this iconic piece of technology was created in desperation just days before filming. Initial designs resembled conventional medical equipment, sterile, white, uninspiring. 3 weeks before shooting the interrogation scenes, Ridley Scott rejected all existing prototypes, sending the props department into panic. Scott sketched a rough design combining an antique bellows camera, microscope components, and vacuum tubes, demanding something that looked Victorian but futuristic. Props master Terry Lewis raided medical surplus stores, camera repair shops, and electronics junkyards. The final machine was assembled from over 30 unrelated components, including parts from a 1940s oscilloscope, a dental examination light, and pieces of a World War II submarine periscope. The bellows that expand and contract were manually operated by crew members hiding beneath the table during filming. The machine wasn't even completed when filming began. Between takes, Lewis was still attaching components with hot glue while electricians wired the lights. This last-minute creation became so iconic that original Voight Kempf props have sold at auction for over $100,000. 13. Joanna Cassidy returned to reshoot her death scene. 25 years later, one of Blade Runner's most notorious bloopers appears during Zora's death scene. As the replicant crashes through glass display windows, eagle-eyed viewers notice something impossible. Joanna Cassidy's face suddenly transforms into that of an obvious stunt, double wearing a poor-quality wig. For decades, this continuity error remained in every version of the film, a glaring flaw in an otherwise visually perfect movie. When preparing the final cut in 2007, Ridley Scott was determined to fix this mistake. But rather than use CGI to patch over the double's face, he made an unprecedented decision. He called Joanna Cassidy, then 62 years old, back to reshoot portions of her death scene, 25 years after the original filming. Cassidy donned a replica of her transparent raincoat and had tracking dots applied to her face. The visual effects team then digitally mapped her facial features onto the stunt performer's body from the original footage. This wasn't just technical perfectionism. It was Scott's gesture of respect toward Cassidy, acknowledging that even a split second of screen time deserved the actual performer. The scene that once contained one of the film's most obvious errors became a showcase for cutting-edge visual effects technology used in service of the original artistic vision. 14. The original screenwriter was fired, then rehired, then fired. Again, Hampton Fancher wasn't just the first screenwriter on Blade Runner. He was the project's originator. After securing the rights to Philip K. Dick's novel, Fancher labored through multiple drafts, envisioning a lower-budget, character-focused film. When Ridley Scott joined, everything changed. Scott wanted a visually spectacular world, demanding extensive rewrites that Fancher struggled to deliver. Scott brought in David Peoples to rewrite the script without informing Fancher, who discovered his replacement only when Peoples's draft arrived at his house. Devastated, Fancher quit the project. But when production began, Scott found Peoples' dialogue too technical and called Fancher back to restore the noir elements of his original drafts. For weeks, two writers worked separate, Peoples creating action sequences while Fancher rewrote dialogue, neither communicating with the other. When Scott needed faster revisions, Fancher was fired again, this time permanently. The credits reflect this chaotic process. Screenplay by Hampton Fancher and David Peoples. The real story involved wounded egos, midnight rewrites, and scripts literally cut apart and taped back together with sections from different drafts. The screenplay, like Deckard's Identity, became a patchwork of competing visions. 15. Edward James Olmos created his character's language from scratch. Edward James Olmos wasn't just cast as Gaff, he reinvented the character entirely. Originally written as a conventional cop with standard dialogue, Olmos refused to play the role as written. Instead, he proposed that Gaff would speak a street language from the multicultural future. Without the production's knowledge, Olmos created City Speak, a mixture of Hungarian, German, Japanese, Spanish, and French. He spent weeks with language coaches, developing not just vocabulary, but an entire syntax. When he arrived on set and delivered his first lines in this invented language, Scott was initially furious about the unauthorized changes. Rather than back down, Olmos offered to quit. After a tense standoff, Scott recognized the brilliance of the approach and allowed Olmos to continue, but demanded translations of everything Gaff would say. The origami figures Gaff leaves throughout the film, another Olmos addition, weren't random. The chicken represented Deckard's cowardice, the man with an erection his sexual desire for Rachel, and the unicorn, well, that became the most debated symbol in science fiction cinema. Olmos received no writing credit for his contributions, but his creative rebellion gave Blade Runner one of its most distinctive elements and deepened the film's multicultural dystopian vision. 16. Ridley Scott secretly changed the film's entire meaning without telling Harrison Ford. The debate over whether Deckard is human or replicant has raged for decades. What fans don't know is that Ridley Scott deliberately planted the unicorn dream sequence, the key evidence suggesting Deckard's replicant nature without informing his star. Harrison Ford played Deckard believing he was human. Scott directed him as if he were human, but privately, Scott had decided Deckard was a replicant. During production, he filmed the brief unicorn dream sequence without explaining its significance to Ford, inserting it almost subliminally into the theatrical cut. The sequence gained prominence in later versions, especially when paired with Gaff's origami unicorn in the finale, implying access to Deckard's implanted memories. When Ford finally realized Scott's intention years later, he was furious. "That was never in the script," Ford complained in interviews. "I played Deckard as a human being." Scott remained Of course, he's a replicant, he stated bluntly in 2007. This fundamental disagreement between director and star created cinema's most persistent ambiguity, a character whose very nature remains contested by his own creators. Not just a narrative uncertainty, but a metatextual battle for Deckard's soul that continues 4 decades later. 17. The cinematography. Most of the film while battling Parkinson's disease. Jordan Cronenweth's cinematography on Blade Runner is considered revolutionary. The smoky atmosphere, the dramatic shaft lighting, the glistening wet streets. What remained hidden was that Cronenweth created these iconic images while fighting the early stages of Parkinson's disease. The symptoms began during pre-production. Occasional tremors, muscle rigidity. Cronenweth told no one, fearing replacement. As filming progressed, he developed strategies to hide his condition, bracing his body against equipment, using assistants to make adjustments he couldn't execute precisely, and designing shots that could be achieved despite his physical limitations. The film's distinctive look, characters emerging from darkness, dramatically side-lit faces, scenes shot through smoke and reflections, wasn't just artistic choice, but practical necessity. These techniques minimized the need for the kind of precise adjustments that had become difficult for him. Only Ridley Scott knew the full extent of Cronenweth's condition. When studio executives suggested replacing him after viewing early footage they considered too dark, Scott threatened to quit. Cronenweth completed the film, creating what is now studied as defining visual cyberpunk. The cinematographer's battle with Parkinson's continued until his death in 1996. His son, Jeff Cronenweth, himself an acclaimed cinematographer, later revealed the darkness he was experiencing physically found its way into how he saw the world through the camera. 18. The film's legacy created an entire video game genre. Blade Runner didn't just influence science fiction cinema, it literally created the aesthetic foundation for an entire gaming genre. The term cyberpunk existed in literary circles before the film, but Blade Runner's visual language, retrofitted technology, corporate dystopia, neon-lit urban decay provided the template that game developers would mine for decades. When the developers of the groundbreaking 1988 role-playing game Shadowrun pitched their concept, they simply showed Blade Runner stills with the phrase, "like this, but interactive." The creators of Neuromancer and Syndicate similarly built their worlds directly from Scott's visual blueprint. The most direct acknowledgement came in 1997 with Westwood Studios' Blade Runner adventure game, which wasn't an adaptation of the film, but a parallel story set in the same universe. The game pioneered voxel technology specifically to recreate the film's lighting effects and atmosphere. Most significantly, CD Projekt Red's creators cited Blade Runner as the primary visual reference for Cyberpunk 2077, one of the most ambitious and expensive games ever produced. 4 decades after its release, the film's DNA remains so embedded in gaming that concepts like Blade Runner aesthetic require no explanation among developers. They simply point to Scott's film and say, "That, make it look like that." 19. The entire script was read aloud to Philip K. Dick. Over the phone, Philip K. Dick's initial skepticism toward Blade Runner is well documented. Less known is the extraordinary measure taken to win his approval. After Dick publicly criticized early drafts, Hampton Fancher became concerned the author would denounce the film before release, potentially sabotaging its reception. In a desperate move, Fancher called Dick direct. When Dick expressed continued reservations, Fancher made an unprecedented offer. He would read the entire screenplay to the author over the phone. Dick agreed. The reading began at 9 p.m. and continued until after midnight. Over 3 hours of Fancher performing every line, describing every scene, even mimicking different character voices. The call racked up hundreds of dollars in long-distance charges, a significant expense in 1981. As Fancher reached the final pages, Dick's attitude transformed. "This isn't just a great adaptation," Dick said when Fancher finished. "You've created something that expresses my worldview even better than I did." The author, who had threatened legal action, became the film's most passionate defender. The phone call not only secured Dick's blessing, but influenced his final work. His novel, The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, written in his last months, contained subtle references to scenes from the screenplay that never appeared in his original story, a creative cross-pollination from a single marathon phone call. 20. The Bradbury Building was already a sci-fi icon before Blade. The climactic confrontation between Deckard and Roy Batty takes place in Los Angeles' Bradbury Building. Its wrought iron railings, open cage elevators, and Victorian atrium instantly recognizable. But this wasn't just convenient location scouting. The building carried specific sci-fi significance that added a layer of meaning most viewers miss. Completed in 1893, the Bradbury Building was directly inspired by Edward Bellamy's utopian science fiction novel Looking Backward, which described a technologically advanced building with a perfect system of balconies with lifts rising and falling without sound. The building's architect, George Wyman, decided to accept the commission after supposedly receiving a message from his dead brother during a planchette session urging him to take the job. The building appeared in dozens of noir films before Blade Runner, but most significantly, it featured prominently in the original Outer Limits episode Demon with a Glass Hand, written by Harlan Ellison. A story about artificial beings with implanted memories who don't realize they aren't human. By setting the film's climax there, Ridley Scott wasn't just choosing atmospheric architecture. He was placing his characters inside physical space that was itself inspired by science fiction and had already served as the backdrop for stories about artificial consciousness, a meta-textual reference to the film's themes hidden in plain sight. Bonus fact: the unicorn dream sequence, perhaps the most analyzed and debated few seconds in science fiction cinema, wasn't in the original theatrical release. This crucial scene, suggesting Deckard is a replicant with implanted memories, wasn't newly shot for later versions. It was filmed during the original production, but deliberately excluded from the first. The footage came from outtakes Ridley Scott shot for an entirely different film, Legend, his fantasy epic starring Tom Cruise, which would feature actual unicorns as major plot elements. Scott had tested some unicorn footage during Blade Runner's production, intending it as a surreal visual representation of Deckard's fading humanity. When the studio mandated the voiceover and happy ending for the theatrical release, Scott removed the unicorn dream, knowing it contradicted the simplified version the studio wanted. Only with the 1992 director's cut did Scott reinsert the sequence, fundamentally altering the film's philosophical foundation. This single reinstated scene transformed Blade Runner from a story about a human hunting replicants to a profound meditation on how memories define humanity. The most significant element of the film's legacy existed for a decade only in Ridley Scott's private cut, a director literally keeping his true vision hidden until he could finally share it with the world. Blade Runner wasn't just ahead of its time, it created our vision of the future. What began as a commercial failure, a production nightmare that left its cast and crew emotionally scarred, has become the defining visual template for how we imagine technology's impact on humanity. The film's troubled production, the conflicts, compromises, and last-minute inspirations mirror its central themes. Just as the replicants struggled to define their identity through fragmented memories, Blade Runner itself evolved through multiple versions, each revealing different aspects of its creation. Perhaps that's why it endured. Like Rutger Hauer's improvised monologue, the truth behind Blade Runner reminds us that sometimes our most profound creations emerge from chaos, conflict, and human imperfection. If you enjoyed these revelations about Blade Runner, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into cinema's most fascinating productions. And share your thoughts below. Are you Team Deckard is human or Team Deckard is Because after 40 years, that debate still isn't lost, like tears in rain.